In an age when Amazon could deliver any book to your doorstep in 2 days, it's hard to imagine anything more quaint than a horse-drawn cart full of books trundling down a dirt road. Yet that's exactly what was happening in Victorian England. And these literary hansoms were making a huge difference to the lives of rural readers. Before mass printing, getting your hands on a book was no easy feat. Not only were they expensive, but unless you lived in a major city, you might not have had a bookshop anywhere near you. And so, if you wanted to feed your mind, you had to go to the books, or more accurately, have the books come to you. The idea of bringing books directly to readers was actually born in 1824 by a man named William C. Redfield, while serving as a missionary in a small town in Wales. Redfield realized how difficult it was for people to get their hands on books, so he came up with the idea of creating a traveling library, which he believed would help spread knowledge and education to those who lived far from schools and bookshops. Initially, this meant hiring a horse and cart and then driving it around the local area, stopping at designated spots where villagers could purchase books from him directly. But while this did bring books to the people, it didn't really encourage reading. And so Redfield's friend, Reverend John Thomas, suggested that instead of selling the books, he should lend them out for free. This proved to be a much better way to promote literacy. And soon Redfield's little project became known as the Denbighshire and Flint Eisteddfod Association Library. While this new system was working well, the area that Redfield was operating in wasn't quite big enough to keep his horses. So he took his business on the road, eventually taking his books all the way across the border into England. Along the way, he continued to refine his methods, adding new routes and scheduling stops at pubs and other public places where people would gather. This made it easier for villagers to borrow books without having to travel long distances to find them. But while the service was proving popular, there was still a problem. People weren't always returning the books, and so Redfield employed a solution that we're all familiar with today: late fees. Charged at a rate of 1 penny per book per week, these fees ensured that people returned the books on time so that they could be delivered to their next reader. It also encouraged people to take better care of the books, as they didn't want to incur unnecessary charges. Despite the occasional challenge, the traveling library was becoming an increasingly popular way to bring books to rural communities. In fact, it became so popular that other entrepreneurs started to pop up offering the same service. And soon, the roads of England were filled with horse-drawn carts, carrying everything from novels to Bibles. But this period of growth didn't last forever. As the Industrial Revolution picked up steam, the towns and cities grew larger and more densely populated. What once had been a rural community might now have been part of a sprawling urban center. And as people moved into towns, they also gained access to stationary bookshops. Suddenly, these traveling libraries were no longer as necessary as they had been in the early days. However, some entrepreneurs saw an opportunity in this shift. Instead of serving rural communities, they started to focus on bringing books to industrial workers who were often crowded into poorly lit tenements. Others started to cater to a more specialized audience, such as children or people interested in religious texts. This allowed them to tailor their book selection and also to charge higher prices, since they were targeting a more niche market. For example, there was the Manchester and Salford Literary and Scientific Association, which provided books to working men on a wide range of topics from politics to science. Then there was the Religious Tract Society, which distributed religious texts to families in industrial towns. These organizations not only provided people with access to books, but also created a sense of community and shared identity. Of course, This didn't mean that all the traveling libraries disappeared. Some entrepreneurs simply adapted to the changing times. They might have kept their horse-drawn carts, but instead of delivering books to villagers, they now served customers in parks or at public events. This allowed them to tap into the growing middle class who were looking for new and exciting ways to spend their leisure time. One such entrepreneur was Mr. William Harrison, who operated a traveling library in Brighton during the late 19th century. Harrison's business was unique in that he didn't just deliver books, but also provided entertainment in the form of a puppet show. He would set up his cart in a public space, put on a puppet show for the children, and then allow the adults to browse his selection of books. This created a fun and engaging atmosphere that encouraged people to come back again and again. But even as traveling libraries continued to evolve, they faced stiff competition from new and innovative businesses. With the rise of industrialization, there were suddenly a lot more leisure options available to people. There were music halls, dance halls, and later, cheap department stores. These offered people a chance to escape the drudgery of everyday life without having to leave their towns. Still, traveling libraries held their own. For many people, there was nothing quite like curling up with a good book. And so these mobile bookstores continued to thrive, albeit on a smaller scale. One of the last hurrahs for the traveling libraries came in 1897 when Queen Victoria died. In the days leading up to her funeral, people across the country were looking for ways to pay their respects to the monarch, and many turned to books. Suddenly, there was a huge demand for books about the Queen's life and legacy. Traveling libraries were uniquely positioned to take advantage of this demand, since they could quickly transport books to where people wanted them, and so many of these businesses saw a surge in profits as people rushed to learn more about the recently deceased monarch. But this boom didn't last long. Within a few years, the UK would be plunged into the First World War, and times were about to get very tough. By the end of the war, many traveling libraries had gone out of business. Those that did survive struggled on throughout the interwar period, but the Great Depression of the 1930s dealt a fatal blow to most of the remaining businesses. By the end of the 1930s, only a handful of traveling libraries were still operating in the UK. And after that, it was every man for himself. The Second World War brought an end to the traveling libraries as we knew them. The government banned the use of horses in public areas, and with no horses, there was no way to operate a traveling library. And yet, despite their demise during the war, the impact of these mobile bookshops should not be underestimated. They played a vital role in promoting literacy and education, especially in rural areas where people didn't have access to bookshops or schools. They also provided a much-needed service to industrial workers who were often crammed into overcrowded cities. And they gave people a chance to escape the drudgery of everyday life by providing them with a mobile bookshop that came to them. So the next time you're browsing the shelves at your local bookshop, take a moment to think about all the people who made that possible. And if you happen to see a copy of Cinderella or Snow White, be sure to give it a little extra love. After all, it might have started out its life on a horse-drawn cart. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe, so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching. Bye. In an age when libraries were considered the palaces of the mind and literature was the opiate of the masses, it's no surprise that people wanted them to come to their own front doors. But how exactly did they do this in Victorian England without the benefit of cars, trucks, or even roads? The answer is pages on wheels. Traveling libraries housed inside horse-drawn wagons that would visit rural villages and industrial slums alike, bringing books and magazines to those who otherwise wouldn't have access to them. In this video, we will be exploring one of these unique historical inventions in all its details, from its humble beginnings in 1827 to its heyday in the 1890s. We will also look at some of the key figures who made this possible, and examine how these book wagons were designed and constructed with wooden shelves, lanterns, and even cozy corners to browse. So sit back, relax, and get ready to take a journey through time as we uncover the fascinating story of Pages on Wheels. Part 2. Wheels Beneath Wisdom. One of the most important innovations in the history of libraries was the development of the traveling library, also known as the book wagon or book cart. This invention aimed to bring books to people who could not travel to a library, such as those living in remote rural areas or crowded urban slums. The first recorded instance of a traveling library was in 1827 when John Bird Sumner, a British philanthropist, started a book wagon service in Hampshire, England. Sumner believed that everyone should have access to books and that libraries should be more accessible to the public. His book wagon was a simple wooden cart filled with books that he would take to different villages in his area. He would set up the cart in a public space, such as a village green, and allow people to borrow books for free. The concept of the traveling library quickly gained popularity, and soon other organizations started providing similar services across the country. In the 1830s and 40s, several Sunday school societies began offering book carts to children in their communities. These carts often contained religious texts, as well as secular books on moral and instructive topics. By the mid-1800s, traveling libraries had become a common sight in many parts of England. They were typically horse-drawn carts or wagons that contained thousands of books and were staffed by a driver and a librarian. The books were organized on shelves, and the wagons were equipped with ladders to allow patrons to browse and select their reading material. Some wagons even had separate sections for children and adults, and some offered magazines and newspapers as well. Traveling libraries were particularly popular in industrial towns where people lived in crowded conditions and had limited access to leisure facilities. They were also used in rural areas, where people might have been too far away from a public library or other sources of entertainment. In addition to providing books, some traveling libraries also hosted events, such as storytelling sessions, concerts, and lectures. These events were designed to promote literacy and education, as well as to provide entertainment. One of the most famous traveling libraries was the Manchester and Salford wagon, which was established in 1839 by John Frederick Herring. Herring was a wealthy businessman who had a passion for books, and he wanted to share his love of reading with others. His wagon, known as the Mechanics' Institute on Wheels, traveled throughout the industrial heartland of northern England, bringing books to people who could not afford to buy them. Herring's traveling library was so successful that it inspired other wealthy individuals to create similar services in their own communities. By the end of the 19th century, there were hundreds of traveling libraries operating in England. The popularity of these libraries declined in the early 20th century as public libraries became more widespread and accessible. However, they left a lasting legacy on the library movement and on the communities they served. Many of the traveling libraries were run by volunteers who were passionate about books and education. They played a vital role in promoting literacy and providing entertainment in a time before television, radio, or the internet. As we delve deeper into the world of traveling libraries, we'll explore the various types of wagons that were used to transport books, as well as the challenges and rewards of running a traveling library service. You will learn about some of the key figures involved in the movement and discover how these innovative libraries shaped the way we think about access to books and education. So join us on this journey through time and discover the fascinating history of traveling libraries. Now let's talk about the design and construction of book wagons. Book wagons were specifically designed to transport books and other reading materials to patrons in a convenient and accessible manner. The design of these wagons varied over time and across different regions, but some common features included sturdy wheels and axles made of wood or metal, depending on the size and weight of the wagon. The body of the wagon was typically made of wood and was enclosed to protect the books from the elements and ensure they remained clean and dry. Some wagons had windows to allow natural light to illuminate the books and make them easier to read. Others had curtains or shutters that could be opened and closed as needed. The interior of the book wagon was designed to maximize the amount of books that could be carried while still allowing patrons to browse and select their reading material easily. Books were typically organized on shelves, which were often adjustable to accommodate different sizes of books and to allow for easy access to the most frequently borrowed items. Some wagons had separate sections for children's books and adult books, while others had designated areas for different genres of literature, such as fiction and non-fiction. In addition to the bookshelves, book wagons often had other features to enhance the browsing experience for patrons. For example, some wagons had tables and chairs where patrons could sit down to read a book or magazine. Others had mirrors or hat and coat racks for the convenience of visitors. Some wagons were even equipped with bells or gongs to announce the arrival of the library and to attract the attention of potential borrowers. The design of the book wagon also took into account the need for portability and ease of use. The shelves were often mounted on rollers or other mechanisms that allowed them to be moved easily within the wagon, and some wagons had folding or telescoping features that allowed them to be set up and taken down quickly. The wagons themselves were usually horse-drawn, although some were pulled by oxen or other draft animals. The horses were kept hitched up to the wagon during the day, so that the driver could take the wagon to different locations as needed. The harness and equipment for the horses were stored in a compartment on the wagon, along with supplies such as oil for the lamps and books. Overall, the design of book wagons was a testament to the ingenuity and creativity of the people who created them. They were not only practical and functional, but also reflected the values and aesthetics of the Victorian era. The use of wood, glass, and other natural materials created a warm and inviting atmosphere for patrons to browse and enjoy literature. And the attention to detail in the construction of the wagons showed the care and craftsmanship that went into every aspect of the traveling library movement. If you enjoyed learning about the history of book wagons, then don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content. And if you'd like to support our channel further, then consider becoming a patron, where you can watch each video before it's released to the public. The year is 1867. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 20 years, and Londoners are celebrating their industry and trade with an international exhibition. The World's Fair is being held in Hyde Park, showcasing new technologies like the telephone and the electric light bulb. But tucked away in the corner is a modest but revolutionary invention that will travel the world and change lives. It's just a simple wooden cart filled with books. That's me, and welcome to my channel, where we explore the hidden histories of everyday objects. Today, we're talking about pages on wheels, also known as traveling libraries. These book-filled wagons were designed by Thomas Hill Green to bring literature directly to rural communities who might not otherwise have access to books. As exhibitions go, this one was pretty successful. Visitors were wowed by inventions from around the world, and the show even made a profit. The buzz surrounding the fair left people excited for future advancements. But one inventor had other plans. His name was Thomas Hill Green. He was a carpenter by trade, and over the years he had dabbled in some inventing, filing patents for things like a self-locking gate. But he really wanted to make an impact. At the fair, he noticed a lot of interest in his friend's invention, the penny. A farthing and a half-a-day newspaper which featured serialized stories that readers would devour. This gave him an idea. What if people in remote areas could get more than just a single story? Green envisioned bringing books directly to them, bypassing the need for a physical bookstore altogether. He began sketching out designs for a movable library, drawing inspiration from the horse-drawn vans used by street vendors. Then he got to work building the first prototype in his carpentry shop. Now, it's important to know that the Victorian era was not a time when reading was novel. People had been reading books for hundreds of years. But while books were becoming more popular, there weren't a lot of places to buy them outside of big cities. And literacy was not widespread. One writer at the time described an English village that didn't have a single circulating library within 10 miles. Green's plan was to solve both of these problems with a book wagon. The idea was simple. A sturdy wooden shelf would be built into the back of a cart, capable of holding up to 400 books. The collection would be curated by local volunteers, and patrons would pay a small fee to borrow books. Then they'd simply return the wagon to the next stop on its route, passing the books along. The entire operation would be run by the local community, with minimal oversight from Green or his assistants. Once the wagon was full, it would head out on its route, stopping at pubs, post offices, railway stations, and other public buildings, until every book had been returned. At each stop, people could browse the selection and borrow a book or two. There was no fine for overdue books, and everyone was welcome to use the service regardless of their literacy level. In fact, the carts were designed to be cozy and inviting, complete with blankets, cushions, and lanterns to encourage visitors to linger and read. One early user said that she liked the wagon so much that she went out of her way to meet it, because it was like having a little sitting room out in the open. Some even had stoves to keep warm during the cold winter months. But what kind of books would be available to borrow? The goal was to provide uplifting and educational material without preaching. There would be fiction and poetry alongside science and philosophy, though Green did specify that lurid and immoral publications should be kept off the shelves. Each cart came with a set of sample books, which included titles like the Holy Bible, the Arabian Nights, and the interesting narrative of the life of Olorda Equiano, a former slave. Though Green's vision was grand, the first few book wagons were slow to take off. After debuting at the 1867 fair, only 3 were sold. So he refined the design, making them lighter and easier to pull. By 1880, he had sold 100 carts across England, Scotland, and Wales. And that brings us to Wheels Beneath Wisdom, which explores the design and construction of these book wagons. In this episode, we learn how Green and his colleagues created shelves that could hold hundreds of books, lanterns that could illuminate them, and cozy corners that would encourage people to linger and read. But before we dig into that, let's talk about why this program is so special. Wondrium is a place where you can feed your curiosity and expand your body of knowledge. It's built around the great documentaries you love, but also features exclusive series and specials you won't find anywhere else. It's easy to get lost exploring all the incredible content. I especially love the collections which curate a list of fascinating topics to explore, like the series Secrets of the Dead or the collection Firsts. I recently watched the documentary Engineering the Future, which takes a look at the emerging field of nanorobotics. It follows researchers and engineers as they try to build machines that can perform surgery inside the human body. The possibilities are endless. Nanobots could help fight cancer, deliver medicine directly to cells, and repair damaged tissues. Wondrium is constantly adding new content, and I can't wait to see what they add next. Now, let's get back to Wheels Beneath Wisdom. As you probably noticed, the most important part of a book wagon is the books. So the team began designing the perfect shelving system to keep them organized and accessible. They decided on simple wooden shelves that could be adjusted to different heights to accommodate various sized books. To maximize the amount of books on each shelf, they angled the top edge so that the spines of the books would sit flush. This meant that the books were packed tightly together, but it also made it easy to see all of the titles at once. Once the books were loaded onto the shelves, customers could easily see the entire collection at a glance. Each shelf could hold around 100 books, meaning that a full cart might carry 400 or more. But how did they keep those heavy shelves stable as the wagon moved through bumpy terrain? The answer was diagonal bracing. By placing boards diagonally across the shelves, they were able to distribute the weight evenly and prevent them from tipping over. This also made the shelves more rigid, so they were less likely to wobble as the wagon bounced along country roads. Once the shelves were sturdy and secure, it was time to add the finishing touches. The team added railings to prevent customers from accidentally bumping them, as well as hooks for lanterns to provide light at night. The result was an efficient and effective shelving system that made it easy for customers to browse and borrow books. But what kind of lighting did they use? Lanterns, of course. Before electricity illuminated the night, lanterns were the best way to provide light in dark spaces. They were often used in street lamps, but they were also popular for indoor and outdoor events. The most common type of lantern used during the Victorian era was the hanging lantern. These lanterns were typically made of metal or glass and hung from a hook or bracket. They were often decorated with intricate designs or patterns, and came in a variety of shapes, including round, square, and octagonal. The lanterns used on the book wagons were typically smaller versions of the hanging lanterns used in street lamps. They were usually made of metal and had a simple, utilitarian design. The size of the lantern would vary depending on the needs of the user, but they were typically tall enough to provide adequate light for browsing books in the evening hours. The light provided by the lanterns was soft and diffused, which made it easier on the eyes and created a cozy atmosphere for reading. They were also designed to be energy efficient, with the team taking care to position them in a way that maximized the amount of light produced. This meant that the lanterns were able to provide enough light for customers to read without wasting fuel. Finally, let's talk about the cozy corners that made the book wagons so inviting. These were the places where customers could sit down and read books in comfort. They were typically located in the corners of the wagon, hence the name, and were designed to be as inviting as possible. The team used soft cushions and blankets to create comfortable seating areas where customers could relax and enjoy their books. They also made sure that the corners were well lit with lanterns, so that customers could read without straining their eyes. The cozy corners were more than just a place to sit. They were a gathering spot for the community. Customers would come to the book wagons not just to borrow books, but also to socialize and catch up on local news. The team knew this, and they designed the corners to encourage conversation. They placed benches and chairs in a way that made it easy for customers to talk to one another while they read. The result was a space that was not only cozy and inviting, but also a hub for the community. By 1900, There were over 300 of these book wagons in circulation across Great Britain and Ireland, each one bringing books and community to the people of rural England. While the concept was Green's and the design was perfected by his colleagues, the real magic was in the details. The shelves, lanterns, and cozy corners created an experience that was more than just a delivery of books. It was a chance for people to come together and explore the world around them. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you think. Did you ever visit a book wagon? Do you still have traveling libraries in your area? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time. The year is 1854. Your friendly neighborhood librarian has just arrived at your doorstep. But he isn't delivering books to you. He is delivering them to a whole community of people who have never read a novel in their life. In the rolling hills of the English countryside, a traveling library has just set up shop. It's not the kind of library that you or I would recognize today. There are no silent readers, no overdue notices, and definitely no shortage of armchairs. Instead, its patrons gather in the open air around the librarian, listening to him read from a selection of books that he's brought with him. And after his performance, they get a chance to ask questions about the story and maybe even propose some alternative endings. For many of these people, this will be the first time that they've ever heard a novel being read out loud. Others haven't laid eyes on an illustration or a picture book since they were children. Yet others won't see their next birthday without attending one of these events. So what's going on here? While it might seem like we've traveled back in time to the days of traveling minstrels, we're actually witnessing the beginnings of public libraries in England. In fact, during the 19th century, thousands of these traveling libraries roamed the countryside, bringing books to some of the most forgotten pockets of Victorian England. Let's talk about Pages on Wheels, the gentle journey of traveling libraries in Victorian England. This particular traveling library was started by two brothers named James and Henry Affordell, after they inherited a large collection of books from their father. Like many well-to-do Englishmen of the time, Senior Affordell had collected books as a hobby and amassed a collection of over 7,000 volumes. But, unlike many of his peers, the Affordell brothers didn't stash their inheritance in a private library where only the elite few could enjoy it. Instead, they wanted to share their father's collection with the people who had never had access to a good book. So, in 1836, the brothers purchased a horse and cart and hit the road, bringing books to rural communities that had never seen a novel before. At first, they weren't quite sure how people would react to their services. But soon enough, crowds of eager listeners began showing up outside the places that they visited. Within no time at all, word of mouth had spread throughout the region, and people were coming from miles around just to hear a book being read. It wasn't long before the brothers were making regular stops at villages, cottages, and even farms, reading to audiences of all ages. And while they did charge a small fee to cover the cost of travel, they offered discounts to poor families and even provided free entertainment for the sick and elderly. Oftentimes, members of the audience would chip in extra money so that everyone in their community could keep enjoying the traveling library's services. And when they had finished reading a book, they often left it behind for people to read for themselves once they had gone. Many of the books that they read came with illustrations, which for many listeners was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see something so beautiful and artistic. Some of the most popular requests included fairy tales, poetry, and religious texts. Though the brothers also made sure to expose their young audiences to classics like Robinson Crusoe and Don Quixote, by the end of their tour, many people had developed a habit of reading and would go out of their way to purchase their own books. The Affordell brothers had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do. But theirs was not the only traveling library to hit the road during the 19th century. As word spread about the benefits of sharing books with rural communities, more and more people got involved. And soon there were thousands of traveling libraries crisscrossing the country. Some of these libraries were run by former actors who had lost their voices and were looking for a new career. Others were staffed by wealthy aristocrats who were looking for a fun hobby. Still, others were started by ordinary working folk who believed that everyone deserved a chance to read a good book. While they came from all walks of life, the staff of traveling libraries had one thing in common: a love of literature. Many of them had spent years performing Shakespeare in traveling theatre companies and knew how to engage an audience with their voices and personalities. They also knew how to tailor their performances to different groups of listeners, keeping everyone entertained and satisfied. One of the most famous traveling librarians was a man named John Kendrick, who started his own library in 1858 after becoming partially blind and losing his job as an engraver. Kendrick traveled all over southern England, reading to audiences in market squares, pubs, and even prison yards. He specialized in reading novels and would often perform for up to 12 hours a day. His booming voice and theatrical flair made him a natural performer, and he quickly became one of the most requested traveling librarians in the country. Unfortunately, not everyone was happy about the popularity of traveling libraries. Some people felt that they were a waste of time, and that people would be better off working instead of listening to stories. Others felt that they were a threat to traditional libraries, and that people would be less likely to read on their own if they got used to listening to books being read to them. These fears were not entirely unfounded, and many traveling libraries struggled to stay in business during the early days. But as the 19th century wore on, people's attitudes towards reading began to change. More and more people saw the value of books and were willing to support traveling libraries in order to get their fix. By the end of the century, there were hundreds of traveling libraries still operating in England, and they had become an integral part of the country's literary culture. Traveling libraries were especially popular in rural areas where people had limited access to books. They were also very popular among farmhands and other working people who didn't have much time to read during the week. For many of these people, the only chance that they had to read a book was to attend a traveling library event on a Sunday when they didn't have to work. Traveling libraries were also popular among families who were isolated from other people. This included families who lived far away from towns and villages, as well as families who couldn't afford to travel. For these people, the arrival of a traveling library was a special treat, and they would often look forward to it for weeks or even months in advance. Traveling libraries weren't just a source of entertainment, they were also a source of education for many people. Some traveling libraries even carried books on science and philosophy, which exposed people to new ideas and ways of thinking. This was especially true of libraries that were run by former school teachers, who had a passion for sharing knowledge with others. While traveling libraries were beneficial to many people, they were not without their problems. One of the biggest challenges that traveling libraries faced was keeping their books in good condition. Books were expensive, and many traveling libraries were forced to make do with whatever books they could find, which often meant that they had to deal with damaged or incomplete books. Another challenge was keeping track of which books were checked out and when they were due back. Since there was no real system for tracking books, many traveling libraries simply relied on the honesty of their patrons to return the books in a timely manner. Despite these challenges, traveling libraries were able to thrive in the 19th century thanks to the hard work and dedication of the people who ran them. These men and women were passionate about sharing books with others, and they were willing to put in the time and effort to make it happen. Thanks to their efforts, thousands of people in England had the opportunity to experience the joy of reading. I hope you enjoyed learning about the fascinating history of traveling libraries in England. If you did, please be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep learning about interesting topics every week. And if you have a topic that you would like me to cover in a future video, please leave it in the comments below. There's something about old-timey pictures of covered wagons that just feels so darned wholesome to me. But when we think about how most people traveled in them, our minds conjure up images of pioneers heading west. Or maybe an 1800s family going to visit Grandma and Grandpa for the holidays. But what if the wagon was full of books? Would that improve your opinion of it? Well, if you were one of the many people living in rural Victorian England, then this would have been a common sight. And while you might be familiar with the concept of a bookmobile, which has its origins in this time period, this was the next step up. It was an entire library on wheels. Let's learn more about Pages on Wheels, the gentle journey of traveling libraries. Traveling libraries are generally credited to Andrew Carnegie, who famously said, "I firmly believe that the more a community is read of a people, the more it will be read too." While he was known for funding free public libraries, which remains an incredible legacy, he also funded bookmobiles to bring books to the most remote places in Scotland and England. At the time, there was no Amazon to deliver books to these isolated communities, and sometimes the nearest library was miles away. So Carnegie's traveling libraries were a godsend. The first bookmobile is said to have started in 1856 in the town of Berwick upon Tweed. But it didn't look anything like the vehicles we know today. It was actually more like a man pushing a cart. But by the late 1800s, Carnegie's goal was to place a library in every parish in Scotland and England. And they took their job seriously. They hired full-time librarians to staff the vehicles, some of whom were women, a rarity for the time. Then they supplied them with a list of rules to follow. Things like making sure the vehicle was always locked when it wasn't attended, ringing a bell 3 times before leaving a stop, and collecting any overdue books at the next scheduled visit. This required significant training for the staff, because each vehicle would travel between 200 and 300 miles every single week. In order to reach the most isolated homes possible, the book wagons had to be large enough to hold thousands of volumes, but still maneuverable enough to fit on small roads and even go off-road when necessary. Most importantly, the carts needed to be horse-drawn. Some were pulled by a single horse and others by 2. And they weren't called wagons or bookmobiles. They were called cars because it sounded fancier. The pace of these cars was determined by the horse, usually about 4 miles per hour. But the driver knew his way around the countryside better than anyone else. So he was in charge of finding shortcuts and avoiding trouble spots. When a delivery took longer than expected, the driver would let the librarian know so they could adjust their schedule accordingly. It was not uncommon for these book deliveries to take anywhere from 8 to 12 hours every single day. While modern technology allows us to make educated guesses about the routes these wagons took, we can get a good idea by looking at maps of Victorian England and seeing where the nearest big cities were to each other. For example, we know that the route between Newcastle and Alnwick, England, followed closely to the River Till, because it allowed the horses to drink along the way. And since the Till was navigable by boat, it was also likely a good indicator of settlements. The same thing happened in Wales, where the Taff Trail follows the River Taff. These trade routes helped the travelling libraries reach the greatest number of people possible. But another important consideration was how busy the roads were. Since the main purpose of these book tours was to deliver books to people who couldn't otherwise get them, The drivers avoided major roads whenever possible. That way, they wouldn't have to compete with all the traffic and could focus on delivering books to their patrons. In fact, these drivers often knew the area so well that they could navigate by landmarks alone. This was helpful when they ran into bad weather because the librarian could change the route to avoid particularly rough roads. So you might be thinking, if the wagons followed the rivers and not the main roads and tried to avoid traffic, then the path they took must have looked something like this. Right, wrong. While these paths do connect small villages, they also pass through plenty of towns, which means traffic, dirt roads, and lots of detours. That is why the best drivers were former stagecoach men, who knew how to navigate traffic and bad weather. But most of all, they were excellent with animals. The horses used for these book deliveries were usually gentle giants. After all, you don't want an overworked animal spooking out in the middle of the countryside, and the drivers had to be calm and reassuring to keep the horses moving forward. It's safe to say that these book delivery services were popular given the number of people who showed up to the markets ready to return their books. But the system wasn't perfect. There were quite a few drawbacks to having a library on wheels. For starters, the wagons were expensive to build and maintain, and if a book got damaged while in transit, there was nobody to blame. Sometimes the drivers would take shortcuts through fields, causing the wagon to bounce and jostle, resulting in cracked spines and water-damaged pages. Other times, children would come running up to the wagon to return a book without realizing it was moving until it was too late. And sometimes dogs would chase the wagon down just to try and get at the unsuspecting horses. And occasionally the horses would just run away. Still, the benefits outweighed the risks, and traveling libraries remained popular in England until the early 1900s. Once automobiles became more common, the demand for book deliveries declined. And by World War II, the popularity of books had waned as well. People wanted to read about things that were happening now, not about fictional characters. By the end of the war, only one book car was still operating. But in the 1970s, there was a revival of interest in older literature, and with it, the popularity of the book car grew again. Today, several book cars are fully operational and can be seen touring the countryside, bringing books to people who want them. So what did these routes look like? Well, given the limited resources available to the Victorians, it's amazing that we can even guess at them today. But thanks to the National Library of Wales and their digitization of historic maps, we can see that the first leg of our journey starts in Merthyr Tydfil. If you've never heard of it, don't worry. I hadn't either. It is a town in South Wales that was once home to several ironworks and is now famous for being the birthplace of actor Anthony Hopkins. But, for our purposes, it's the starting point of our journey. We'll start by following the river downstream until we hit the village of Quaker's Yard. Here, we'll meet up with the river again after passing through Nelson and Pentabach. Then we'll head east until we reach Dowley Top. From here, we'll continue north, avoiding the river until we get to Merthyr Moor, at which point we'll follow it until we reach Cardiff. Now, to be clear, this is only part of the journey. In fact, it's only about a quarter of the whole trip. But the point isn't to get all the way to London in one go. It's to show you what the path looks like. As you can see, the Taff Trail is a mostly flat route that avoids major roads and follows the river closely, ensuring that the book wagon can always find fresh water for the horses. This is exactly the kind of path that makes sense for a book tour, because it takes the reader to places where people live, not where businesses are located. This process works because the trips are timed with market days. This way, the wagons arrive when people are already gathered together, and if they happen to coincide with harvest time, all the better. Since farmers have downtime from planting and are looking for entertainment, these stops are also timed with the seasons. In the summer, people enjoy light reading, like novels and poetry, while in the winter, they prefer non-fiction books, like science and philosophy. Of course, there's always an audience for classics, like Shakespeare, Dickens, and the Bible. But knowing your audience helps the librarians select the most popular books and ensure that everyone leaves with something they'll enjoy. Plus, bringing books to rural areas helps keep people from feeling isolated. And that's something we can all relate to, no matter where we live. Thanks for watching. Sign up for our free newsletter and get one cheesy fact about medieval history delivered straight to your inbox every Friday. And as always, thanks for watching. How did people read before bedtime? With candles, of course. But no, not that simple. Let's turn back time and get ready to learn how reading was lit in the gaslit streets of Victorian England. Before electricity illuminated our lives, people used candles, oil lamps, and gas lights to read in the evenings. Each light source had its own unique charm and challenges, creating a cozy yet sometimes hazardous atmosphere for avid readers. Welcome to our channel, where we bring history to life through stories of the past. Today, we are taking you on a journey back to Victorian England to explore the ways people stayed illuminated while they perused their favorite novels during the night. So, sit back, grab a book, and join us as we uncover the secrets of reading by candlelight. The flickering glow of candlelight painting dancing shadows on the walls, as it revealed the worn pages of a beloved novel. For many Victorians, candles were the primary source of light for reading in the evenings. These simple, cylindrical sticks or tapers made from beeswax, spermaceti, a waxy substance from sperm whale heads, or tallow, rendered animal fat, were dipped into molten wax or melted candles to coat them in a thin layer of wax. This coating allowed them to burn more evenly and cleanly, extending their lifespan and reducing smoke and soot production. The coated candles were then placed in candle holders, which could be as simple as a tin candlestick or as elaborate as a brass and crystal chandelier. The choice of candle holder often depended on the social status and wealth of the household. Candlelight reading was not without its challenges. However, candles were expensive, and their flame could be easily extinguished by drafts or vibrations. Furthermore, the soft glow they emitted did not always provide enough light for detailed tasks, such as reading fine print. Despite these challenges, candles provided a warm and inviting ambience for readers to curl up with a book and lose themselves in another world. In the quiet of their rooms, the gentle crackle of the flame, accompanied by the scent of burning wax, filled the air, creating a cozy atmosphere that enhanced the enjoyment of literature. For those who lived in dimly lit cities or rural areas, candles might have been the only source of light available for evening reading. In these cases, they would have been an invaluable tool for staying entertained and educated, as well as providing a comforting source of light in an otherwise dark room. Overall, candles played an essential role in the reading habits of Victorians, allowing them to enjoy their favorite stories in the evenings despite the limited lighting conditions. But there's more to this story. The soft glow of oil lamplight casting long shadows as a family gathers around the hearth to share a book. Oil lamps were another popular source of light during the Victorian era, offering a brighter and longer-lasting flame than candles at a lower cost. These lamps consisted of a simple glass or metal container with a handle, a wick, and a reservoir for holding the oil. The most common type of oil used in lamps was olive oil, but other options, like kerosene and paraffin oil, became available as the century progressed. The oil was poured onto the top of the lamp and allowed to soak into the wick. Before being lit, the flame produced by oil lamps was brighter than that of candles, making it easier to read with. Additionally, oil lamps were less prone to sudden extinguishing and could burn for several hours before needing to be refilled. They were also versatile and could be hung from a hook or placed on a table, allowing for flexible lighting options in different locations. However, oil lamps did have some drawbacks. The flames produced by oil lamps were not as steady as those of candles, and they could produce a strong odor and smoke, especially if the oil was not clean or the lamp was not properly ventilated. Additionally, the glass containers used in oil lamps were fragile and could shatter if the oil was spilled or the lamp was mishandled. Despite these challenges, oil lamps remained a popular source of light for reading during the Victorian era, particularly in homes with limited access to candles or other forms of artificial lighting. Their affordability and versatility made them an accessible option for many families, allowing them to enjoy the comfort of reading in the evenings. The gentle glow of hearth firelight illuminating faces as family members gather around the fireplace to read aloud. During the Victorian era, the hearth fire was a central feature of many homes, providing both warmth and light for those gathered around it. While not as concentrated or as bright as candlelight or oil lamp light, the soft glow of the fire could provide enough illumination for those who enjoyed reading by its flickering flames. Families would often gather around the fireplace in the evenings to read aloud to one another, sharing stories and enjoying the crackle of the burning logs as they illuminated the room in hues of orange and yellow. The firelight created a cozy atmosphere that encouraged conversation and bonding among family members, while the flickering shadows added a sense of magic and wonder to the experience. However, reading by firelight did have its limitations. The intensity of the light varied depending on the size and brightness of the fire, and it was not as controllable as other light sources. Additionally, the constant flicker of the flames could make it challenging to focus on the text, and the heat from the fire could be uncomfortable, especially in warmer months. Despite these challenges, many Victorians found that the warmth and intimacy of reading by firelight were worth the effort. The crackling flames provided a soothing backdrop for curling up with a good book, and the soft glow of the fire added a touch of romance and nostalgia to the experience. Whether reading fiction or non-fiction, the shared experience of reading aloud by the fire was an important part of family life during the Victorian era. It provided a way for members of the household to bond over their love of literature and create lasting memories in the cozy glow of the hearth. The soft glow of gaslight illuminating the streets as people stroll home from work, passing by lampposts that cast their glow on nearby bookshops and libraries. With the invention of gaslighting in the mid-19th century, many cities began to adopt this new technology to illuminate their streets. Gaslights were a significant improvement over traditional oil lamps or candles, as they provided a brighter, more consistent light source that could be easily turned on and off. The introduction of gaslighting had a profound impact on reading habits during the Victorian era. The brighter illumination allowed people to venture out to bookshops and libraries even after dark, expanding their access to books and information. The safety provided by gaslights enabled people to travel to and from these establishments without the fear of being robbed or injured in dimly lit streets. As the popularity of gaslighting grew, libraries and bookshops became hubs of activity in the evenings, with people of all ages coming to browse the shelves and borrow materials. The cozy glow of gaslight streaming through windows, revealing the rows upon rows of books inside. Bookshops and libraries were often designed with large windows to display their wares and allow passers-by to browse the selection. The soft glow of gaslight streaming through these windows created an inviting atmosphere that beckoned readers to step inside and discover new literary treasures. The interplay of light and shadow cast by the gaslights added a sense of mystery and intrigue to the books displayed, making them seem all the more enticing. The warm glow also provided a comfortable setting for customers to relax and peruse the books at their leisure, making the shopping experience all the more enjoyable. As the popularity of books and reading grew during the Victorian era, bookshops and libraries became essential community spaces, made possible by the introduction of gaslighting. The bright and inviting illumination provided by gaslights made it safer and more pleasant for people to visit these establishments, fostering a love of reading and learning among the community. And there you have it, a glimpse into the world of Victorian England and how people kept their reading illuminated in the evenings. From the cozy glow of candles to the soft illumination of oil lamps and gaslights, each source brought its own unique charm and challenges to the experience of reading at night. At the end of the day, whether curled up by the fire, browsing in a bookshop, or strolling home from work, the Victorians found ways to keep their love of reading alive through various means of illumination. We hope you enjoyed this journey through time. If so, please don't forget to show your support and stay tuned for more exciting historical tales. How do you get a book to a child who has never read a book before? That is a tough question, and one that only the most dedicated educators and librarians have ever asked themselves. But what if, instead of asking how to get a book to a child, we ask how to get a child to a book? How would you solve that problem? Hi, I'm here to talk about some British people whose whole job was to get children to books. This is part 7 of my series on traveling libraries called Pages on Wheels. And today, I want to talk about how these libraries brought books to kids, particularly children who had never read a book before. When I wrote the first episode of this series, it was really hard to find sources about early children's literature. There just wasn't much written about it. Now, when I wrote the 6th episode, which focused on the literature for children, I found that there were tons of great resources out there. So why the sudden change? Well, the answer is that children's literature is its own genre. It's an entire world of stories, authors, publishers, and librarians. And all of that means there's a lot of material out there to use as sources. And now that I've got the hang of where to look for good sources, I found lots of them. So many, in fact, that I had to cut this episode down to focus just on the way that books were presented to children, rather than trying to talk about every type of story that was available. Fairy tales and fables were incredibly popular with both children and adults in the Victorian era. The Victorians collected and retold traditional folk tales from around the world and also created their own original stories. You might be familiar with the work of Hans Christian Andersen or the Brothers Grimm. These authors collected and adapted stories they heard while traveling around Europe and the United States. Many of these stories were quite dark and gruesome, and so authors adapted them to make them more suitable for children. The next genre of books that were popular with children were adventure books. These books were often about exploring far-off lands or going on exciting quests. They usually had a strong moral message. Think The Swiss Family Robinson or The Jungle Book. The most popular author in this genre was G.A. Kinty, who wrote over 60 adventure books for children. Now that we know what types of books were popular, let's think about how they were presented to children. The first thing to consider is the format of the book. Was it a picture book or a chapter book? Picture books were obviously best for younger children who were not yet reading, or those who were just beginning to learn how to read. Chapter books were for older children who could read independently or with the help of a parent or teacher. Another important consideration was the illustrations. Illustrations were incredibly important in children's books, even more so than in adult books. The pictures were often what drew children to a book in the first place, and they also helped to engage the children's imaginations. The most popular illustrator of the time was Kate Greenaway, whose delicate line drawings were featured in many of the most popular children's books. But let's go back to the original question. How did these books get to children? Well, there were a number of ways. One way was through the public library system. In the 1850s, several free public libraries began opening up around the country, and they soon realized that they needed to provide books for children as well as adults. Another way was through schools. Many schools had a small library that students could use during their free time. And finally, there was the method we're focusing on today, traveling libraries. Traveling libraries were a relatively new idea in the 1800s, but they quickly became very popular. The basic idea was to send a person with a collection of books to different locations, such as schools, churches, and public spaces. And then that person would stay for a set amount of time, usually a week, and let people borrow books. This was a great way to reach children who might not otherwise have access to books. One of the most important things about traveling libraries was the person running them. They needed to be patient and kind, as well as organized and efficient. They also needed to be passionate about books and sharing them with others. Most traveling librarians were volunteers, often from the Women's Institute, a charitable organization founded by Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise. Traveling libraries were extremely popular in England and Scotland, and there were several different organizations that ran them. The most prominent was the School Library Association, which was founded in 1888. By 1905, they had 266 traveling libraries serving 234,000 students. One of the most interesting aspects of traveling libraries is that they were often run by women. This was because women were seen as being more suited to working with children. Also, women were generally not allowed to work in the traditional library setting. Since they weren't considered to be professional, traveling libraries provided an opportunity for women to work as librarians without having to deal with the same restrictions. The first step was getting the child interested in books. This was often done by reading aloud to them or telling them stories. Once the child was interested, the librarian would then help them to choose a book to take home. It was important to choose a book that was appropriate for the child's age and interests. If possible, the librarian would also spend some time talking to the child about the book and helping them to get started. So, let's look at a few examples of how this process might have looked in practice. Let's say that we are in a small village in the English countryside. A traveling librarian arrives with a collection of books and sets up shop in the village schoolhouse. Soon, children begin arriving. Some of them have never seen a book before. The librarian begins by reading aloud to them from one of her favorite books. The children are captivated, and soon they're begging her to tell them more. After she finishes her story, the librarian takes some time to talk to the children about the book. She asks them what they liked best and why. She also asks them if they know anyone who might like the book. Then she lets the children choose a book to take home. A little girl named Elsie chooses a book about a princess who goes on an adventure. The librarian helps Elsie to get started on the book, and then she says goodbye. Elsie takes her book home, and she can't wait to start reading it. She sits down and begins to look at the pictures. She doesn't know how to read yet, but she doesn't need to. The pictures are so detailed and so engaging that she feels like she is right there in the story with the princess. As she looks through the book, she thinks about all the adventures she could have if she were the princess. She decides that she wants to be a princess when she grows up. When her mother comes home from the market, Elsie runs to show her the book. Her mother sits down and looks through the book with her. She reads aloud to Elsie and they talk about the story. Elsie's mother knows how important books are, and she wants her daughter to love books too. So she makes sure to make reading time special. She and Elsie snuggle up on the couch together and read every night before bed. Elsie's little brother, Thomas, sees how much fun Elsie is having with her book, and he wants to get in on the action. He asks if he can have a book too, and her mother says yes. Thomas is a little too young to read, but he loves listening to stories. Elsie reads him the princess story again, and he is mesmerized. He doesn't understand all the words, but he doesn't need to. He can see the pictures and he can hear the excitement in Elsie's voice. He decides that he wants to be a prince when he grows up. From that day forward, Elsie and Thomas are bookworms. They read everything they can get their hands on, and they often read the same books to each other. Years later, when they are all grown up, they both become teachers. They want to share their love of books with their students, and they know that everyone can benefit from reading. They teach their students that books are a magical place where you can go on adventures and learn new things. They also teach their students that books are a place where you can escape to when times are tough. Most importantly, they teach their students that everyone can be a hero or a princess, and that anything is possible if you just believe. So, there you have it, the gentle journey of traveling libraries in bringing books to children in Victorian England. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by leaving a like or a comment below. I'd love to hear what you thought. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I post new videos every Friday, and I would love to have you along for the journey. Hello, friends. Today we are going to talk about the language of book plates and bindings. Because this is not just a decorative element, but an integral part of the Victorian novel that communicates a wealth of information to those who know how to read it. In fact, even more than today's dust jackets and promotional material, the binding of a Victorian book acts as its own advertisement, letting readers know what the story is about before they ever crack open the spine and start reading. Now, I've spoken before about how the cover design and illustration for Victorian novels were an intrinsic part of the marketing strategy for these books. And this was even more true when these books were sold as part of a set like this collection of fairy tales by the German author Friedrich Wilhelm Mersenne. Each of these stories was published in its own volume with its own unique cover design, so that when they were displayed on bookshelves together, the collection could be easily identified and browsed. But once a customer had selected their set, how were these books packaged up to be taken home? They were wrapped in a fancy box, of course, like this one here, which also features a rather fetching embossed design. These boxes cost a bit extra, but were well worth the price if you wanted to impress your friends and family with the literary Christmas present you had received. And that's why I think these are such a useful thing for us to look at today. Because they give us a kind of sneak peek inside these books without having to disturb the original packaging. So let's start with the basics. If we take a look at the exterior of the box, there are three things in particular that catch our attention. First, the overall color. Second, the embossed design. And third, any gilt lettering or decoration. Each of these has its own meaning, and the more expensive the edition, the more elaborate these design elements tend to be. For example, this box is made of cardboard and is covered in a dark blue wrapping paper with a floral pattern. This is relatively plain compared to some of the other examples we'll look at today. But the embossed design is quite striking. Let's have a closer look at that. In the center of the lid, we see a castle with a drawbridge coming down, surrounded by trees and bushes. In the foreground, there are two lovers embracing. At the top of the lid, there is a woman in a tower holding a banner which reads Holden. And on the other side, there is a man standing next to a large tree. On the bottom of the lid, we see the title of the story inside, The King of the Golden River. Now, if we take out the books and turn them over, we can see that the design on the lid of the box matches exactly the illustration on the cover of the book. So already, we can see how the illustrations on the covers of each individual book worked together to advertise the set as a whole. But what about the embossed design itself? What is the significance of this technique, and why was it used here? Well, embossing is simply a way of decorating surfaces by pressing a design into the surface of the material so that it appears raised. It's commonly used for bookbinding, where the image is pressed into the leather or cloth covering the book. The process of embossing involves placing a sheet of metal, usually made from an engraved design, against the surface of the material and then hammering or pressing it into place. This causes the surface to rise up, creating a textured effect that catches the light as you move the item around. Embossed designs can vary greatly in complexity, ranging from simple geometric patterns to highly detailed images and lettering. And as you might imagine, the more labor-intensive the design, the higher the price tag. And that brings me to another key aspect of these book boxes, namely that they were often far more elaborate than the covers of the books they contained. You see, these boxes were undesigned to be opened and closed a dozen times a day by shopkeepers and library assistants. They were intended to be opened only once, after which the contents would either be read and then put on a bookshelf, or given as a gift, and therefore, booksellers and publishers spared no expense when designing the exterior packaging for their products, knowing full well that it would act as a sort of advertisement, as well as a point of sale. For example, here's another box from the same collection of fairy tales. And, as you can see, the floral wallpaper and castle illustration have been replaced with something far more eye-catching. Instead, we have a bare marble background offset by a deep red curtain in the corner. The main image shows a king presenting a golden river to two children, while in the foreground we see a castle with a woman in a tower waving a flag. It's as clear that this image is supposed to be read in conjunction with the image on the cover of the book, which shows the same characters walking away from the castle. By matching the exterior and interior illustrations, the contents of the book could be easily identified and quickly pulled off the shelf. But what about the gold leafing? Why was that used on some of these boxes and not others? Well, gilding is a decorative technique used to apply a thin layer of gold leaf to a surface. The process typically involves brushing or hammering a very thin layer of gold leaf onto a surface that has been prepared with a special adhesive. Gilding is commonly used in bookbinding, picture framing, and furniture making to add a touch of elegance and sophistication to the final product. For example, this box, from a cheap edition of Oliver Twist, uses a stenciled design painted directly onto the surface of the cardboard. But when it came to more expensive books, gold leaf was used instead to create a more eye-catching effect. Here is an example of a first edition of The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, published by Ward, Lock & Co. The cover is bound in dark blue crushed Morocco leather with gold tooling along the edges and boards. The front board features a central medallion depicting the portrait of Dorian Gray. Surrounding the medallion are delicate, floral, and geometric patterns which intertwine to form a border around the edge of the board. Along the spine, there are raised bands and intricate gold leaf designs that further decorate the book's exterior. These gold embellishments not only serve an aesthetic purpose, but also signify the book's value and exclusivity. Gold leaf was expensive and time-consuming to apply, making it a luxury reserved for high-end publications like this one. There's a great article about the symbolism of gilding in Victorian bookbinding in the Victorian web, which I'll link to in the description. It says, gold leafing, gilding in general, whether done with leaf, paint, or ink, played an important role in the Victorian period, marking the preciousness of the object to which it was applied. Because of the cost and difficulty of gilding, especially in the early Victorian period, an amateur would seldom attempt it. When found on a book, it marks it as special, often indicating fine binding. During the later Victorian period, gilding became easier through the introduction of new tools and materials, so it appears on more books and less expensive ones as well. And the author goes on to explain that gilding is just reserved for religious texts or works of art. It's also a popular way to decorate items for special occasions, such as christenings, weddings, and funerals. Finally, there's one more key element of these boxes that deserves our attention, and that is the lettering. As I mentioned earlier, the most expensive editions of books often had the titles of the books embossed or gilded on the front cover. But that wasn't the only place that the title could be found. Sometimes it was repeated on the front of the box, too. Take this copy of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, for example. The title is written in black lettering on a white background, which contrasts sharply with the dark green cover of the box. Or here's another example of a novel by Wilkie Collins, The Moonstone, where the title is written in white on a dark blue background. The contrast between the lettering and the background is so great that it almost looks as though the title is floating on the surface of the box. The use of contrasting colors for the lettering is no accident. You see, one of the most important things to remember about Victorian books is that they were not only meant to be read, but also meant to be shown off. The brighter and more eye-catching the design on the cover and the box, the more likely it was to attract the attention of potential readers. And what could be more eye-catching than a bright white design on a dark background? But there's another reason for this, too. You see, these boxes were often made of cheaper materials than the books they contained. That's why they're often quite flimsy and can be easily torn or damaged. The bright colors on the front of the boxes served another purpose, that of hiding any imperfections in the cardboard underneath. That's why it was so common for the insides of these boxes to be completely blank. The publisher didn't want you looking at the sides or the ends of the box, which were usually plain and made of a cheaper, weaker cardboard. So there you have it, a quick introduction to the language of bookplates and bindings. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is just a soft dive into the subject, and there's a lot more I could say about this topic. So, if you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more on the subject, please let me know in the comments below. 19th century England was not well known for its efficient transportation systems. That is, unless you happened to be a book lover living in a village that received visits from one of the many traveling libraries that operated during the Victorian era. These literary commoners would arrive on a cart, or sometimes even a donkey, carrying with them the most up-to-date novels and newspapers from London. And while their wares might have been considered cheap sensationalism by the upper classes for rural readers, these books offered an escape from the hardships of life in 19th century England and gave them access to literature that might otherwise have been impossible for them to obtain. As the Industrial Revolution raged on, people flooded into cities to take advantage of new job opportunities, which meant that for the first time ever, a huge number of people were living in close proximity to each other. This led to some serious overcrowding issues, not to mention disease and poverty. As a result, the countryside seemed like a much more appealing place to live. However, For people who didn't have enough money to buy a house in the country, they were out of luck because country living was usually only accessible to the wealthy. But thankfully, there were plenty of people willing to bring the country to them. Traveling libraries began popping up all over England, starting in the 1830s, and they were largely run by former soldiers. Since veterans had already had experience with traveling long distances on foot, it wasn't much of a stretch for them to trade in their uniforms for waistcoats and their rifles for reading material. By the 1840s, there were around 200 veteran-owned circulating libraries operating throughout England, and the trend was only growing from there. They made up something of a postal service, delivering goods like books and pamphlets to customers who lived far away from the shops that sold them. They also kept their prices low, making literature more accessible for those living in poverty. But of course, this came at a cost. The veteran entrepreneurs weren't doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. They had to make a living, too. And while they might have been able to get away with charging a few extra pence in wealthier areas, the majority of their clientele depended on low prices to make reading affordable. This created an interesting dynamic between the library owners and their customers. They had to walk a fine line between providing affordable books and making sure they still turned a profit. Fortunately for them, there was a large market for cheap books in England at this time. People of all classes loved sensationalist novels about crimes, disasters, and scandals, and the vets were happy to oblige. One author even wrote a story specifically for the circulating libraries that became so popular it spawned its own series. Of course, not everyone was happy with the rise of these traveling tale-tellers. The establishment saw them as nothing more than purveyors of trashy literature and did what they could to discredit them. Even the wealthiest members of society thought it was beneath them to be seen buying books from a peddler. So these library owners often had to be careful about where they showed their wares. In some cases, they found a way around this problem by turning their deliveries into social events. And that's why, today, we're going to travel back in time and find out how traveling libraries brought tea, talk, and tales to the masses. There are very few things in life that can compare to the feeling of curling up on the couch with a good book and a warm beverage. Maybe that's why one of the best parts of our sponsor, this week's episode, Shortform, is that they love books as much as we do. Shortform takes some of the best non-fiction books ever written and condenses them into easily digestible 15-minute reads, giving you more time to enjoy even more books. I can read Shortform anywhere and anytime. It fits into my busy schedule, and I never have to worry about lugging around heavy books or having space to set them down. My favorite thing about Shortform is the wide variety of topics they cover. If I want to learn more about psychology, history, business, science, philosophy, or spirituality, they have a book for me. This week's selection, The Power of Habit, by Charles Duhigg, explores how habits are formed and broken, not just on an individual level, but within businesses and entire societies. Habits are everywhere, and understanding how they work will help you succeed in every aspect of your life. And now, back to tea, talk, and tales. In order to understand how tea, talk, and tales came to be so deeply intertwined, we need to look at the state of tea drinking in Victorian England. For centuries, tea had been considered a luxury good and was only enjoyed by the elite members of society. However, thanks to innovations in tea processing and packaging, tea became more popular among middle and lower classes during the 19th century. What's more, tea drinking became a social event in homes across England. Families and friends would get together to enjoy a pot of tea and catch up on the latest gossip. In fact, afternoon tea became such a beloved tradition that many people started holding it in honor of guests. Now, while this might sound lovely in theory, it put quite a bit of pressure on homeowners, especially women who were typically responsible for hosting these gatherings. Not only did they have to make sure the tea was hot and the sandwiches were plentiful, but they also had to provide entertainment. After all, no one wants to sit in awkward silence while sipping their tea. To make matters worse, the same expectations were placed upon them when they were the guests. Women had to make sure to bring along a plate of goodies to share and be prepared to fill their hostess' ears with pleasant conversation. The stakes were high. Gossip columnist William Makepeace Thackeray once wrote that if a woman didn't bring enough cakes to a party, she risked being labeled a bad hostess for the rest of her life. This created an interesting dilemma for women who frequented the traveling libraries. Let's say a book delivery arrived on Tuesday, and they could possibly finish all the novels before the weekend rolled around. Their options were limited. They could either rush through the books and risk ruining their reading experience, or wait until their friends came over for tea and share the wealth. Before long, it became commonplace for women to start their reading sessions early in the day, then put the book aside once their friends arrived. Then, once the last crumb had been eaten and the final story had been shared, they would go back to their books. This created something of a community around the traveling libraries. Women looked forward to their weekly deliveries not just for the books, but for the opportunity to socialize. But not all traveling libraries were visited by eager readers looking for tea and gossip. Some owners took their carts to the countryside and sold their books to farmers and farmhands who worked long hours during the day and had little time for entertainment. In order to cater to these customers, some libraries offered evening deliveries so workers could pick up a book after a long day as labor and curl up next to the fire before bed. And while this was convenient for the buyers, it presented an interesting challenge for the sellers. You see, evenings in Victorian England were not exactly safe. Highway robbery was common, and footpaths were rarely well lit. This meant that library owners had to be cautious about walking around with sacks full of valuable books late at night. Fortunately, many of them found a solution to this problem in the form of a tea and crumpets. It was not uncommon for library owners to stop at a local tavern for a pint and a bite to eat before continuing their deliveries. And since tea and crumpets were usually served with a side of gossip, it wasn't long before word got out that these traveling libraries were more than just purveyors of cheap books. They were also sources of entertainment. People in the area began requesting tea, talk, and tales alongside their Thomas Hardy novels and sensationist magazines. This gave the libraries a unique selling point that helped them stand out from the competition and likely increased sales. It also created another community of readers who looked forward to seeing the library owner as much for the chance to chat about the latest scandal as they did to borrow a new book. Of course, some people were less than thrilled about these traveling libraries becoming social events. When the novelty wore off, some readers realized that they were spending more time sipping tea and eating biscuits than actually reading. And to make matters worse, the conversation often centered around gossip. Sometimes this gossip was harmless, like the latest royal scandal or a neighbor's new bonnet. But sometimes it veered into dangerous territory. On occasion, people would use tea and talk to spread rumors about others in the community, which could end up causing real harm. Despite this, the practice stuck around for many years. Likely because the benefits of having a traveling library far outweighed the potential drawbacks. Not only did these libraries bring books to people who might not have had access to them otherwise, but they also created a sense of community. Readers were no longer confined to their own four walls. Thanks to tea, talk, and tales, They were part of a larger group of people who shared their love of books and their desire for a good story. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out my novella series, which is available on various platforms. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And what better place to witness this phenomenon than the realm of literature? What could be more timeless than the written word itself? Well, perhaps the means by which we deliver it. Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today, if you want to get your hands on a book, you can simply visit your local store or download an ebook or audiobook to your device. But did you know that not too long ago, you might have had to travel miles to get your hands on a good read? That's because, for centuries, books weren't exactly all that accessible. For most of history, they were expensive, rare commodities owned only by the wealthy elite. And while things began to change during the 18th century, when the printing press allowed for mass production and subsequently cheaper prices, books still weren't all that common until the Victorian era. The Industrial Revolution brought about several changes in society, including unprecedented urbanization. As factories sprang up across England, people from rural areas flocked to cities in search of work, and cities became overcrowded and impoverished. With rampant poverty came rampant illiteracy. In fact, during the mid-Victorian period, roughly half of England's urban population couldn't read. Not to mention, given the lack of public transportation, it would take a healthy adult between 4 and 5 hours to walk to the nearest circulating library. So how could these poor urban dwellers experience the joys of reading without having to travel miles and waste precious time and money? Enter Pages on Wheels, traveling libraries carried by horse-drawn carts or vans that brought books directly to those who could not access them otherwise. In this episode, we will be looking at how these unique libraries functioned and how they helped bring literacy to the masses. It was a tough job. The hours were long and the pay was low. To put it mildly, the majority of people working in England's poorest cities did not make more than a few shillings a week, and many made far less than even that. But there were exceptions. Working for a Pages on Wheels library paid better than most other low-level jobs. However, despite the slightly higher wages, working as part of a Pages on Wheels team was no easy feat. The job required great physical endurance, as the team members often had to walk behind their cart or van, pushing it along the route. And let's just say that some streets were far from well maintained. According to an 1897 report from the London County Council, roads in the area were often full of holes and loose metal. So not only did the teams have to walk behind their carts, they also had to keep a wary eye out for stray dogs, which often darted into the road and caused accidents. Imagine almost losing your balance while walking behind a heavy cart with hundreds of books in it. Yikes. Despite the danger, men, women, and even children eagerly applied to be part of the program. One of the most famous Pages on Wheels workers was named James Morton. He started working for the Newcastle Library's Page on Wheels department in 1862 at the age of 14 and retired 43 years later at 57. Throughout his career, he walked over 250,000 miles, the equivalent of walking from Land's End to John O'Groats in Scotland and back 12 times. That's incredible. His dedication was rewarded as he was given a royal honor in 1905. King Edward VII knighted him for his services to the city's libraries, making him one of the few Pages on Wheels workers to receive such a prestigious award. But what kind of person would leave such a legacy? While there is little documentation about Morton's personal life, he left behind an account of his experiences in the Newcastle Daily Journal. According to his words, his route took him across Newcastle's West End and Byker, where he would call at 16 stops before returning to the library. He would leave his house around 8 a.m. and return around 5 p.m., arriving home just in time for dinner. On busy days, however, he would leave earlier and get home later. If there was bad weather, he would sometimes have to wait at his stops for hours, while people came to collect their books. In fact, he once waited 9 hours for 8 children to come and collect their books, so that he could continue on his route. Traveling libraries were popular in England between the 1850s and the 1920s. They provided a vital service, bringing books to those who lived too far away from a library to realistically travel there themselves. But it wasn't always plain sailing. There were numerous issues that plagued these traveling libraries, from funding cuts to finding enough volunteers to staff them. Fortunately, many kind-hearted individuals stepped up to help out, including a man named John Frederick Herring. Herring was a builder from Northumberland who loved reading books by authors like Victor Hugo and George Eliot. When he heard about the Pages on Wheels project, he wanted to get involved. However, as he got older, he found it harder to keep up with the physically demanding job of pushing carts full of books. So instead, he donated to horse-drawn vans to the Newcastle Libraries department. The first was a light van for use during the summer months, and the second was a heavier van for wintertime. These vans were covered in canvas to protect the books from inclement weather, and they proved invaluable in helping the libraries reach more people. In fact, in 1879, Newcastle Libraries director James Cossins credited Herring with enabling the department to extend its services to more than 35,000 readers, 15,000 of whom were children. And while Herring's donation was incredibly generous, it wasn't quite enough to cover all the costs involved in running a traveling library. According to a report published in 1897, each van cost between £300 and £400 annually to operate, an amount that included the salaries of the drivers, pages, and horses. Fortunately, the local council recognized the value of these libraries and allocated funds to keep them running. Still, there were never enough funds to go around, and traveling libraries relied heavily on donations from people like Herring to stay afloat. One of the most dangerous parts of being a Pages on Wheels worker was crossing the street. Unlike today, there were very few traffic regulations back then. People could drive whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and pedestrians had to dodge carts, cabs, and animals on a daily basis. Most Pages on Wheels workers knew the risks of the job and took precautions to stay safe. One woman named Mrs. Fryer, who worked in the 1890s, told her biographer that she always walked backwards while on the job, so that she could see where she was going. This practice, however, did make it difficult for her to carry out conversations with the people she passed, which she often found disappointing. Perhaps one of the most magical parts of being a Pages on Wheels worker was witnessing the joy that books brought to people's lives. For many of the people who used these libraries, it was the only form of entertainment they could afford. Some people would wait all week for the arrival of the traveling library, and children would beg their parents to take them to the nearest stop so they could borrow a book. In fact, it was thanks to Pages on Wheels that many people learned to read. Volunteers would organize classes for children on their routes and teach them the basics of literacy. Once the children learned to read, they would often ask for books about religion or moral lessons, which the volunteers would provide. In this way, traveling libraries helped to create a more educated and well-rounded community. And while Pages on Wheels were primarily meant to serve poorer communities, they also played a role in educating wealthier people. In fact, it was thanks to a traveling library that Agatha Christie, the author of Murder on the Orient Express and many other famous mysteries, developed her love of reading. She was just 8 years old when she discovered the power of books through the Pages on Wheels that visited her hometown of Torquay. These days, it seems like we have more access to books than ever before. Thanks to technology, you can hold entire libraries in the palm of your hand. However, that hasn't stopped us from still appreciating the value of a good, old-fashioned bookstore or library. Perhaps we've all grown tired of swiping and scrolling, and have decided to slow down and savor the physicality of reading a book. Or maybe we just love the smell of old books and the quiet atmosphere of a library. Whatever the reason, bookstores and libraries are still beloved institutions in our society, and we can thank Pages on Wheels for helping to create that love. In 1899, the Daily Mail carried a story about an 8-year-old girl who was looking forward to something special happening at her house. It wasn't her birthday or Christmas, but it was still cause for celebration. Her father had paid his first quarterly subscription to the South Hackney Lending Library, which meant that soon a box would arrive containing up to 6 books that she could borrow. And while the idea of reading books delivered to your door might seem unremarkable today, this was revolutionary. This young girl was living in poverty and would not have had access to books otherwise. Books were expensive and libraries rare in Victorian England. In 1851, only around 1 in 10 people could read, and even fewer women than men. But thanks to philanthropic efforts, this girl and many others like her would be able to enjoy literature without ever having to set foot in a library. The story of how books got onto the pages of wheels. Hi, I'm here to introduce you to our new series, Letters to the Librarian. We've scoured archives across the UK, Ireland, Canada, and Australia to find heartfelt notes left in the margins of library books. Some are desperate requests from children. Others are angry rants from disgruntled adults. There are love letters, death threats, and everything in between. And we can't wait to share them with you. Today, we begin with a look at Pages on Wheels, the gentle journey of traveling libraries in Victorian England. When the Industrial Revolution caused major population shifts, cities swelled with people from the countryside looking for work. Living conditions were cramped and poor, and there wasn't enough infrastructure in place to go around. So local leaders began to search for ways to improve the lives of their poorest citizens. Enter the Mechanics' Institute, a community center that offered educational resources like evening classes and lectures. They covered a range of subjects, from science to politics, religion to literature. But there was one key component missing. In 1824, Thomas Hill, secretary of the London and Edinburgh Association for Promoting the General Knowledge and Amusement of the Labouring Poor, wrote to mechanics institutes across the country, asking them to consider adding a library to their existing institute. He felt that reading was the cornerstone of all knowledge and an important means of self-improvement for those stuck in poverty. But the working-class people he was trying to help didn't always see eye to eye with this sentiment. The working-class reading room movement began in the early 1820s, when workers in northern England noticed that many of their fellow labourers couldn't read. Feeling that this lack of education was holding their community back, they pooled their money together to buy books, which they then lent out to anyone who wanted to borrow them. By 1836, there were 17 reading rooms in Yorkshire alone. While these were more akin to social clubs than libraries, the concept caught on. Across the country, people donated books and money to get similar projects off the ground. Often, these books would come from private individuals, but wealthy patrons also donated entire libraries. The success of the working men's libraries inspired others to follow suit. The Working Men's College Library Association, founded in 1848, focused specifically on providing books to poorer students. 3 years later, Birmingham opened the Free Library, the first free public library in England. However, This wouldn't have been possible without two key innovations. Andrew Carnegie had just invented the cheap, sturdy paperback book. Meanwhile, Richard Owen was developing a classification system that made it easy for library staff to categorize and shelve books. No longer did library patrons have to sit around waiting for someone to dig through a collection of books to find the one they wanted. Instead, they could browse the stacks themselves. These innovations, combined with growing support for libraries among the middle class, led to a proliferation of free public libraries across the country. Still, some people were left out. While many urban areas had libraries by the end of the century, rural communities were often neglected. But there was hope on the horizon in the form of a railway carriage. The railways had been a godsend for transporting books into big cities. But what to do with all those empty carriages once they reached their destination? One man saw an opportunity. John Willis moved to Stoke Newington in North London in 1888 after being appointed librarian of the newly opened Hackney Public Library. A strong advocate for public libraries, Willis believed everyone should have access to books, regardless of their income or location. But he knew that many people in rural areas simply couldn't afford to travel into the city. So he came up with a solution, converting an old railway carriage into a traveling library. On the inside, it looked like any other book-filled room, complete with shelves and a desk. He painted the outside of the carriage bright red and emblazoned it with the words "Free Library." Then every week it would depart from the main library and travel to different towns, bringing books directly to the people instead of the other way round. The service was so popular that soon Willis had converted 3 carriages and was making several trips every week, covering over 200 miles each time. Seeing the success of the Hackney Library, other public libraries began to take notice. Between 1898 and 1903, the London County Council created its own fleet of 5 travelling libraries, each of which travelled to 5 different stops every week. While the initial investment was high, it quickly paid dividends. As London County Council librarian James Oliver reported in 1903, "We find that wherever the travelling library goes, people turn up who have never attended a library before, and we gain new readers." These weren't the only books on wheels. Subscription libraries, like the South Hackney Lending Library, mentioned at the beginning of this episode, also used horse-drawn vans to deliver books to their patrons, while the wealthier patrons could afford to pay higher fees and have books delivered more frequently. The less affluent had to wait longer between deliveries, and sometimes had to pay extra for the privilege of having their books delivered at all. For example, the Christian Young Men's Association of Great Britain charged its poorer members an annual fee of 2 shillings and 6 pence, while the wealthier members paid 10 shillings. But if members lived within walking distance of the association's premises, they could avoid paying delivery fees altogether. As libraries on wheels became more popular, people began to donate books specifically for use in the mobile units. London's travelling libraries received more than 2,000 books from the Reading Room, Women's Library Association, while other libraries received donations from groups like the Church Army, whose stated goal was to supply good, wholesome literature to the poorer classes. While well-meaning, such donations were not always appreciated. Margaret Foster's biography of writer Thomas Hardy includes a particularly amusing anecdote about the subject of the book receiving a surprise delivery of religious tracts. According to Foster, Hardy was working in his garden when a travelling library made a delivery to his home. She writes, "He came back from the garden to find a pile of tracts deposited on his table, and he sent them all back with a note saying he does not read tracts except those of the kind commonly found in gardens." To which the lady replied that she was very sorry to hear that Mr. Hardy considered the tracts too good for a garden. but she could assure him that the birds and the rabbits read them with great pleasure. Even so, most of the feedback about the travelling libraries was positive. Readers across London eagerly awaited their weekly visits and the chance to borrow new books. One patron wrote to the Hornsey Library, "I want to thank you for sending us the book van. As there are lots of poor people round here who cannot afford to buy books, and I think it is doing a lot of good." Another resident of Holloway wrote, "Your travelling library has done a great deal of good amongst us poor people, for we are mostly very poor in this district. I wish you would come more often." Similarly, residents of Stoke Newington thanked the library for enriching their lives. "The book van has been a great blessing to us," they wrote, "and a great comfort in sickness. Many of our young men have joined the church now, and we believe it is owing to the good books they get from the van. Unfortunately, we have not been able to track down the name of this young girl who was looking forward to receiving books from the South Hackney Lending Library. However, we know that the books she borrowed probably weren't bestsellers." Both the Hornsey and Stoke Newington libraries reported that their most popular books were religious texts, and those aimed at improving the minds of working men. That is because many of the people using these travelling libraries were menial labourers who struggled to make ends meet. They needed books that were not only entertaining, but also offered messages of hope and redemption. So while we may never know what stories captured the imagination of this 8-year-old girl, we do know that she and her neighbours had access to books they would not have had otherwise. And for that, we can all be grateful. Thank you for watching this episode of Letters to the Librarian. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos. Special thanks to my channel patrons who make videos like this one possible. The year is 1877 and the place is England. More specifically, it's rural England, where many villages are isolated. Dusty affairs with few conveniences or entertainments and even fewer books. But twice a week, the villagers have an appointment with the future. For, at precisely scheduled intervals, they hear the clip-clop of approaching horses and the rumble of a wagon. And when this wagon arrives, it brings with it not just books, but the chance to learn and be entertained, to connect with others, and maybe even make a little money. This wagon is a library on wheels, known locally as a page on wheels, which has come to anchor the community in more ways than one. In the late 19th century, almost every town and village in England had its own circulating library, a sort of book subscription service that allowed people to borrow books without needing to buy them. These libraries were often small affairs run by local shopkeepers who would set up a lending library as a side gig. A village might also have a public library, usually housed in a church or some other prominent building, open to all comers. But there was a problem. Rural folks were often too poor to pay the fees associated with these libraries, and the libraries themselves were often inconveniently located or closed on days when villagers had time to read. That's where the pages on wheels came in. These travelling libraries were the idea of the Victorian era's most famous librarian, Andrew Carnegie. No, not that guy yet. It was the other Andrew Carnegie. Anyway, after working in his father's library as a boy, Andrew Carnegie the Elder set out to reform libraries across Britain. One of his ideas was to establish free travelling libraries for the rural poor, funded by wealthy landowners and run by librarians who would drive around the countryside bringing books directly to villagers. The first page on wheels hit the road in 1861, and soon dozens of libraries across England had followed suit. A typical page on wheels might travel 2 to 3 days a week, covering between 6 and 12 villages each trip. The caravan would arrive at its first stop around 9 a.m., staying until 1 p.m. At this point, A crowd of villagers would likely gather around the wagon as the librarian unloaded shelves of books onto a folding table. After that, people would browse and borrow books, and then the librarian would move on to the next village, repeating the process. And while these libraries did bring books to poor rural communities, they were about much more than just making sure everyone had access to literature. They were also an opportunity to escape the drudgery of everyday life. Imagine your day consists of tending animals, cooking meals, and cleaning clothes. You get a few hours to yourself in the evening. So what do you want to do? Well, how about attend a lecture on Shakespeare? Or maybe a poetry reading? Pages on Wheels often featured entertainment in addition to their educational opportunities. Villagers could enjoy a song or a story, and maybe even participate in a lively sing-along. And because these events were free, they offered a cheap form of amusement for people who couldn't otherwise afford it. Not only were these events fun, they were a vital source of information for people who lived in an age when newspapers cost a lot and few people could afford them. In fact, the pages on Wheels sometimes featured current events readings, in which librarians would share summaries of recent news with eager listeners. Beyond entertainment and education, these wagons also helped forge a sense of community. Many of the same people would show up to every event, and some would travel to neighboring villages just to take part. As one observer put it, the arrival of the library was an event which many of the inhabitants looked forward during the week. Indeed, it was not unusual for people to plan their social calls around the schedule of the page on Wheels. But perhaps the best thing about these wagons was their ability to bring quiet joy to people's lives. Like the 7-year-old girl who told her mother she liked the pictures in the books she borrowed from the traveling library, or the old man who said he liked to read poetry because no one else in his house cared to listen to it, or this woman who said she enjoyed the books so much she would keep them out for weeks at a time. That last quote comes from an 1894 report on the Birmingham Public Library's pages on Wheels, which reveals that these wagons weren't just beloved by the villagers, they were beloved by librarians, too. The librarian who ran that particular wagon loved his job so much he refused to retire even after going blind. That was thanks in part to the support of the villagers. You see, in addition to being a library, the pages on Wheels were often a kind of business, too. In some cases, librarians were paid by the library system. In others, they were paid by private subscriptions from the people they served. And in many cases, the success of a page on Wheels depended on the good graces of local innkeepers, who would let the wagon stay in their yard overnight. But the pages on Wheels were never a purely commercial enterprise. While a librarian might need to hustle to make ends meet, they also had the freedom to organize their route however they wanted, stopping wherever they had the time and resources to do so. And many librarians took great pride in their work. Not only did they bring books to people who couldn't otherwise get them, they were also ambassadors of culture, bringing the best of poetry and literature directly to the masses. And they weren't just bringing books, they were bringing the tools for financial literacy to pages. On Wheels often featured penny readings, informal lectures or performances that cost a single penny to attend. They were immensely popular, drawing crowds of up to 100 people. And while attendance was technically supposed to be limited to children, adults would sneak in if they could. Penny readings covered a wide range of topics, including science, history, and literature. They gave villagers a chance to learn new things, but they also provided an outlet for those who wanted to share their knowledge. In fact, many of the penny readers were volunteers, including teachers, ministers, and members of the local intelligentsia. This meant that villagers were exposed to a variety of viewpoints and encouraged to think critically about the world around them. The impact of these penny readings cannot be overstated. They were instrumental in the creation of adult education programs across England, helping to lay the groundwork for the country's modern comprehensive school system. But pages on wheels were also a business, and that meant they had to adapt to the times. While England's rural population was growing, so was its urban population. By the early 20th century, more than half of the country lived in cities, and many of them didn't have access to libraries. So, in 1907, Andrew Carnegie donated enough money to establish free public libraries in towns across England. Suddenly, there were plenty of indoor libraries to go around, and the pages on wheels could finally retire. All right, now check out why Andrew Carnegie still matters today. Or watch this video instead. The Age of Steam. An era of innovation when the very foundations of society were being laid down. Railways were one such innovation which transformed travel, trade, and even leisure in Victorian England. And while most people associate trains with their own journeys, there's one rather unusual type of railway traffic that often gets overlooked: traveling libraries. That's right. Imagine if your local library was a train car. Well, actually, you don't need to imagine it, because it happened. Not only did mobile libraries exist in the Victorian era, they were all the rage. Today, we are going to be looking at these pages on wheels and how they brought literature to the masses. On a typical day in London, you might find yourself sharing a carriage with a family of 4, a nanny, a parrot, 3 dogs, and several boxes of books. All are aboard the railway for the simple purpose of disseminating knowledge across the land. In this case, the train is bringing literature to the isolated communities of rural England, a mission made all the more important by the fact that the majority of people in the country are functionally illiterate. That's where traveling libraries come in, or, as they're known in contemporary documents, circulating libraries on wheels. The idea is deceptively simple. Take books to where the people are, but the reality is far more complex than that. To understand how these book trains worked, we have to start at the source. The London and North Western Railway Carriage and Wagon Department, based at the town of Wolverton in Buckinghamshire. This is a huge complex of workshops, where everything from dining cars to entire locomotives are designed and built. It's here that the bulk of the traveling libraries will be created, with each one containing thousands of volumes. But the contents of these mobile repositories are not the product of any single individual. Instead, they're compiled using suggestions from station masters who know their local customers best. The books are drawn from a pool of donated volumes, as well as from the personal collections of wealthy railway directors. So if you're riding the rails in search of the latest Shakespeare, you might be out of luck. These libraries are stocked with penny dreadfuls, cheap, sensationalist fiction aimed at working men. You'll also find plenty of religious tracts for good measure, since religion and reading are considered by many to be synonymous. Once stocked, the carriage is locked up tight to prevent theft and vandalism. Then it's attached to the end of a passenger train, usually at night, to avoid disrupting the regular service. At this point, the library itself becomes the responsibility of the guard, who has the duty of seeing it safely to its destination. From there, it's unloaded and set up in a prominent location, typically the station building, where people can begin borrowing books. A nominal fee is charged, but the books themselves are free to take away with the expectation that they'll be returned within 7 days. So far, so good. But why exactly are these traveling libraries even necessary? After all, people aren't exactly flocking to borrow books from the nearest bookshop. To understand the appeal of the traveling library, we have to look at how people consumed literature in the late 19th century. Forget about e-books and audiobooks. People in the Victorian era had neither of those options. If you wanted to read a novel, you had two choices. Either you could purchase the book outright and join a reading society, a sort of Victorian book club, where members would gather together and take turns reading aloud from their favorite novels. The problem with this approach is obvious. Not everyone can afford to buy a new book every week, and not everyone enjoys the same stories. And besides, reading aloud is painfully slow. The other option is to frequent a public library, but unfortunately, these are few and far between, particularly in rural areas. And even if you live near a library, you might not want to go there. In the mid-1800s, reading material was rapidly becoming a marker of class distinction. And some poorer folk don't want to be seen frequenting the same establishment as the local aristocrats. That's why traveling libraries became so popular. They provided a way to access books without having to leave home or work. Better yet, they offered a wide variety of reading material since the books were donated by private individuals. There was no censorship to worry about, meaning people could read the most lurid penny dreadfuls without fear of reprisal. But the real genius of the traveling library is that it took literature to the people, rather than the other way around. That meant that even those too poor to afford their own copy of a book could enjoy the latest sensation as long as they were willing to share it with their friends. The results were astounding. People who had never held a book in their hands before were suddenly devouring literature, prompting calls for greater investment in rail-based libraries. By the end of the century, over 500,000 volumes were circulated in this manner, changing lives and spreading knowledge across the land. Not only were the libraries a boon for readers, but they were great advertising for the railways, which frequently received positive press coverage as a result of their innovative community outreach programs. Everyone wins. So what went wrong? Why don't we see these book trains running today? Sadly, the answer is twofold. First, traveling libraries became obsolete, thanks to the very thing that made them possible, the railway network itself. As more and more permanent libraries were constructed in the late 1800s, people no longer had to rely on the erratic schedule of a traveling library. Even the advent of the paperback revolutionized how people consumed books, making it cheaper than ever to buy your own copy. And while the novelty of a book train might seem appealing now, the reality is that these libraries were hardly a reliable way to consume literature. You had to wait until the book train came to your local station, which might be weeks or even months. And once you got your hands on the book, you only had 7 days to read it before it was taken away again. That's not exactly conducive to settling in for a nice story. Still, just because these libraries are gone doesn't mean their impact isn't still felt today. After all, people still love a good book, and thanks to the work of the railway companies and the generosity of countless donors, more people than ever have access to literature. So next time you pick up a book and settle in for a nice story, take a moment to remember the traveling libraries and the slow, steady progress that brought books to the people. In the late 19th century, it was fashionable for wealthy Englishmen to drive about the countryside in horse-drawn carriages, visiting friends and relatives who lived far enough away that a simple day trip could not be made. But a leisurely journey through the English countryside meant little if one had no way of knowing what lay around the next bend, or whether the path ahead might not be long and lonely. And so, just as people began taking cameras along on their travels to capture all those fleeting moments, they also filled their carriages with books to pass the time. That is, of course, unless they were already lucky enough to have an in-car library like the one installed in the Duke of Northumberland's carriage, which featured not only an extensive collection of novels, but also adjustable shelves, a writing desk, a sofa, and even a wheelchair for his dog. However, while these luxurious in-car libraries were well suited for the whims of an individual reader, there remained a sizable segment of the population whose reading materials were not nearly so accessible. Enter the traveling library, a system by which books were brought to the people, rather than the people going to the books. For many rural communities, this new service was an absolute godsend. As the editor of the Gentleman's Magazine wrote in 1872, "It has been our good fortune to travel in districts where these circulating libraries are in operation, and we have thus had an opportunity of seeing the great boon which they are to poor villages where there is no public library, no bookseller, and no means of intellectual recreation." But while the concept of bringing books directly to readers may seem fairly straightforward, the reality was actually a bit more complicated, as pioneers of the traveling library soon discovered. It seems almost quaint to us today, but the greatest obstacle facing those who wanted to start a traveling library was winning over the public, specifically the public's horses. From the outset, the success of any book delivery system depended entirely on its ability to reach a high volume of people without losing too much time and money in transit. In other words, it had to be fast, efficient, and affordable. And that meant making stops at multiple homes on a single journey, something that horses could easily do if given proper motivation. The teamsters hired to drive the early book wagons typically received payment in two forms: money and beer. At least, that was true in the case of Mr. T. Lloyd, who, in 1863, piloted a 4-horse wagon laden with books up and down the hills near Oxford, all in a day's work. In fact, he became such an enthusiastic advocate of the traveling library that when he retired from driving, he took up carpentry and built bookshelves for several of the local schools. By the 1870s, traveling libraries were becoming quite popular in southern England. Among the most successful routes was that run by bookseller George Smith, who sent out 5 book wagons daily from his shop in Southampton. Smith's business model was quite savvy. He recognized that many of his customers would want to purchase books outright after first previewing them on loan. So he created a system by which customers could pay for a book while they borrowed it and then keep it once they depaid in full. Of course, this presented something of a challenge in terms of bookkeeping, as Smith explained to a representative of the builder in 1875. "I let customers have as many books as they like on the hire system, and they pay me for them weekly or monthly. I cannot trust them to return the books till I have got my money. If they take my books and don't return them, they get lost. I send my men out every evening to collect money, 2-4 books, and they bring back those books which have been read and are not wanted any longer." Though perhaps surprisingly, he reported that of all the money owed him, only about 5 shillings were ever lost to bad debt. For some booksellers, traveling libraries provided an entirely new source of revenue. Others, however, saw them as something of a threat. Early in 1874, a group of London stationers wrote to the Worshipful Company of Stationers, asking them to put a stop to the practice of lending books in this manner, citing the loss of revenue to local businesses and concerns that books loaned for free might not be returned. Predictably, the Venerable Company of Stationers, whose stated purpose was to protect the trade, sided with the booksellers, and the traveling library wagons rolled on. As the years went by, the traveling libraries grew increasingly popular, though the growth wasn't entirely organic. Much of it was thanks to the efforts of those who lobbied local governments to support the effort. One of the first such advocates was William Clark, a member of the Birmingham Town Council, who argued that not only would the travelling library boost literacy rates, but it would also keep children out of the streets and away from potential harm. His comments were prescient, as the number of children enrolled in elementary schools in England and Wales increased from about 1 million in 1872 over 4 million by 1900. Still, Clark and others had to contend with a prevailing notion of the time that poor people did not want to better themselves through education. As author and cleric Charles Kingsley famously said, "Ignorance is their protection. They do not want to be educated because they know that ignorance is their shield against taxation." Only by demonstrating that travelling libraries could succeed in bringing books to rural readers without costing an unreasonable amount of money did Clark win over his colleagues. Enough to fund a trial of the concept. On September 18, 1875, the Birmingham Daily Post announced that the council had purchased 250 volumes to be circulated among the town's poorer residents. The catch was that, unlike Smith's system, which relied on customer payments to sustain itself, Birmingham's travelling library was entirely free. To make the venture viable, the city hired a team of volunteer teachers to deliver the books to schoolchildren, who would then be expected to return them the following day. Within weeks, the program had expanded to include 1,000 books and 10 teachers. And by the end of the year, the council voted to quadruple the budget for the following year's run. Travelling libraries continued to grow in popularity throughout the rest of the century, in part because they proved so amenable to local flavour. In some cases, libraries were divided into two distinct sets, one for adults and one for children, with books being delivered to each household twice a year. Elsewhere, entire schoolrooms were outfitted with bookshelves and used as neighborhood libraries, while in other towns, books were simply left on doorsteps overnight. Not surprisingly, the most popular books of the time were those with pictures. As one teacher recalled, "We used to leave books at the houses of the scholars, and sometimes we found that during the night animals had come in and carried off the picture books." By the end of the century, there were more than 1,000 travelling libraries operating in England, though fewer than 1,000. As the 19th century drew to a close, progress came to a shuddering halt with the onset of the Great Depression. A financial strain on local governments, coupled with the rise of purpose-built public libraries, spelled the end for most travelling libraries. Still, the idea didn't go away. And in the decades since, travelling libraries have enjoyed something of a revival. In 1931, the American Library Association formed the National Bookmobile Association with the goal of expanding access to books in underserved communities across the United States. In 1934, Congress appropriated funds to build bookmobiles for the U.S. Army, which deployed them throughout the country and abroad in World War II. More recently, in 2018, a non-profit called Pages to Prisoners started delivering books to inmates in California state prisons, aiming to inspire rehabilitation through literature. Today, there are still over 3,500 bookmobiles serving more than 30 million Americans each year, mostly in rural areas where access to physical libraries can be limited. Some are staffed by librarians who tailor their offerings to each community they serve, while others function more like a team is, dispensing books at the push of a button. But regardless of their size, scope, or staffing levels, each one carries within it the spirit of those Victorian wagons, quietly spreading stories wherever wheels can roll. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the story. Thank you for watching.